There is a fairly widespread belief among many fans that with the sequel trilogy, Disney has effectively killed the Star Wars franchise. But the idea that with 3 films, Disney has ruined fans' love for the franchise just doesn't fit with how fans have historically reacted to subpar Star Wars films. Let's take a brief look at the history of the franchise, touch briefly on why the franchise is currently in such a rocky state, and look to the future and the many ways in which the Star Wars franchise can still flourish and grow. Prior to the sequel trilogy splitting the fanbase, there were already 3 separate made-for-TV films that had caused a similar controversy. The Star Wars Holiday Special, made in 1978, Caravan of Courage and Ewok Adventure, made in 1984, and Ewoks: The Battle for Endor, made in 1985. Now, myself, my entire friend group, my family members, basically everyone I know is a fairly big Star Wars fan, and yet none of us have seen or even care about these movies. In fact, when you talk about spin-off movies, people talk about Rogue One enthusiastically, and most fans agree that Solo was even a good film, but these 3 are never mentioned by anyone. And when the prequels came out, they were despised by many fans, with backlash not just against the wooden dialogue, but midichlorians and Jar Jar and probably 100 other things. These films were borderline hated in a way that a Star Wars film had never been hated before. And many of those fans who hated and ignored the prequels came back happily and enjoyed the sequels. The same sequels that many prequel fans absolutely hate and refuse to acknowledge as canon. This, my friends, is why Star Wars as a franchise is just fine, because people have always ignored the films they didn't like.
That's Dad! Where is that? What is it? It looks like a monster or something real big!
Now, even if you absolutely loved everything about The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, and the soon-to-come-out Rise of Skywalker, you have to admit that many fans do not agree with you. Even the prequels, as contentious as they were, didn't do as much damage to the franchise as the recent films have. Star Wars is undeniably in a rocky state, but that doesn't mean it's dying. We had 16 years between Episode 6 and Episode 1. We had a decade between Episode 3 and Episode 7. And you know what happened? The franchise flourished. But how? We went from this amazing film to these being the very next 2 films that Lucas made. These movies should have killed any interest fans had in the franchise, but instead what happened? The franchise grew. Then the prequels came out, which half of the fan base hated. That's 5 movies back-to-back that were poorly received by the fan base. And what happened? The franchise grew even bigger. Throughout its less than 40-year history, the franchise has had twice as many hated films as beloved films. So how in the world did the franchise manage to grow so large when they keep making content that half of the audience hates? I have friends who despise the Clone Wars, who absolutely refuse to acknowledge Sky Guy and Snips.
You're stuck with me, Sky Guy.
What did you just call me?
There are people who hate Rebels, people who hate the Resistance, there are probably people who hate The Mandalorian, and the franchise will be fine. Because people will always love the original reason they first began watching these films. For me, I did not become a fan until this exact moment.
We'll handle this.
We'll take the long way.
For me, it was Darth Maul and the Jedi and the amazingly quick choreography of the prequel fight scenes that made me become a fan. I absolutely adore lightsaber battles, so much so I wanted to film my own, so that I could be part of the community that loves lightsaber battles as much as I do. Maybe for you it was the droids, maybe the unique space battles, maybe the mysticism of the Force really appealed to you. Whatever it was, that original attraction is unchanged by any material that will ever be produced. It's an interesting comparison. These older films were disliked due to their quality much more than their content.
You're like family to me. Bye, everybody. Well.
They didn't ruin characters, reset storyline, negate any prior accomplishments of past films. They were just lower quality films with a storyline that fans didn't find appealing. They didn't deliver anything new and meaningful. They weren't even entertaining enough to ignore their major flaws, like many of the prequels.
I don't like sound.
And on the opposite side of the coin, the sequel trilogy was, at the very least, entertaining, with some great acting as well as some amazing cinematography and set design. Seriously, I could watch The Force Awakens with the sound off just to appreciate the amazing job their director of photography, Dan Mindel, did with the visual aspects of the film. But these were bad films, especially The Force Awakens, from a storyline perspective, because they ruined nearly every single story element and character from the original 6 films. And if you haven't seen my 2 reviews explaining my reasoning for that statement, I'll leave links in the description. So when I say that the state of the franchise is better than you'd think, because these movies didn't kill our interest, these movies won't either, I do realize that it's not a direct comparison, that the sequel trilogy was far more damaging to the franchise than all these other bad films combined. After all, the holiday special and Ewok movies were all side films, so they're easily shrugged off and ignored, while episodes 7 and 8 were main films starring main characters. If you hated this version of Han, how can you simply choose to ignore that this hero turns into this coward? But even acknowledging the mental gymnastics many of us are going through to try to ignore the dystopian future the sequel trilogy gave us, Star Wars will always flourish because the original world and its characters are so amazing. If everything Disney does with Star Wars fails for the next 50 years, fans will still be talking about Luke and Obi-Wan, Yoda, Dooku, even characters we've never seen, like Mara Jade and Saboth and Thrawn. Because, my friends, if you're disheartened at the state of the franchise, this is what you need to realize. You did not become a Star Wars fan to see what Luke would be like when he grew up.
I am a Jedi, like my father before me.
You did not spend years, maybe even decades, as a fan because you were waiting to see episodes 7 through 9. The sequels were something we speculated and hoped for, but not something that we built our entire love for the franchise around. The sequel trilogy did not ruin Star Wars because you fell in love with Star Wars long ago for other reasons. The sequel trilogy can never ruin Luke or Han or Leia because these aren't the characters you fell in love with. These are. The past isn't going to die. Disney isn't going to kill it. These are the Star Wars you fell in love with, and my friends, they aren't going anywhere. Star Wars fans have always ignored the films they didn't like and passionately pursued everything about the films they did like. For some people, it was the prequels that ruined the franchise. Some fans don't accept Solo as being the same character. They think it's just Disney's fan fiction of Han's backstory. Many hardcore fans currently refuse to accept the sequel trilogy as reality. They still talk daily, years later, finding new ways constantly that the sequel trilogy was disappointing. And you know what? That's okay.
What?
I wish they had been better films, with a cohesive story that completely connected them to the previous 6 films. But you know what? I also wish these films would have been better, and had well-written storyline that made them completely connected with the main films. Star Wars has gone through some very unique stages of development over the years. It began as one movie. If you loved Star Wars, you loved this single movie. Then by 1987, if you said you loved Star Wars, you could mean that you loved the original movie, or loved the second but not the first or third. Or loved the entire trilogy but hated all the stupid Ewok side films? Or that you loved absolutely everything remotely related to the franchise?
I spent Christmas playing with plastic Tauntauns. Christmas in my Millennium Falcon.
And yes, I know that was made after 1987, I just wanted to get that song stuck in your head again. And now in 2019, look at the enormous amount of material that we have available, even if a lot of it has been relegated to legends. Now, if you say you love Star Wars, what exactly does that mean? Do you love all the major films equally? Do you like Clone Wars but hate Rebels? Love the prequels, hate the sequels? The Star Wars franchise has very slowly been transforming to be a very complex new entity, and it's a transformation that I think many fans have missed. People seem to be operating under the assumption that Star Wars is still a fixed idea, while in reality it's now a very fluid, subjective thing. When someone asks me what I love most about Star Wars, these are what pop into my head. The stories and characters in these books contain everything I love about the franchise, and are far, far more in-depth than a film could ever hope to be. But ask my brother and he may say the Clone Wars TV series is what he loves the most, because he loves Rex 5's Echo 99, Dogma, Tup, Wolf, Heavy, and all the rest so much, and you get to see so many awesome battle scenes with awesome backstory of how the Clone Wars progressed. So how can he or I say that the sequel trilogy has ruined the franchise when we just said it was a different, specific, completely unrelated part of the franchise that made us fans in the first place? Really, the best comparison is for us to look at our arch enemies. Ask 6 Star Trek fans what their favorite movie or series is, and you're very likely to get 6 different answers. They like Next Generation, they like the original series. He loves all the movies but hates the TV shows. She loves all the TV shows but hates the movies. He likes Deep Space Nine, she likes Voyager, he likes Enterprise, and every single one of them hates Discovery. As another comparison, look at Doctor Who. There have been 14 different actors portraying the Doctor, with some people being fanatical about Matt Smith, but absolutely hating everything Eccleston did, or loving the second half of season 3, but hating the first half. And yet all of these fans say they love Doctor Who. And what about James Bond? Some people hate Brosnan but adore Craig, and some purists only will watch Connery, yet they all say they love James Bond. Did you love Stargate? Stargate SG-1? What about Stargate Atlantis? Or Stargate Universe? And nearly every nerd I've ever talked to absolutely loves Battlestar Galactica, while at the same time all of us absolutely refuse to acknowledge the terrible way it ended. Ladies and gentlemen, this is where the Star Wars franchise has been heading. This is what our fandom needs to evolve to be. A unified group that each loves a completely separate element of the franchise. It is okay for him to like Kylo, for her to admire and love Rey. It is okay for this guy to love what the sequel trilogy did to Luke, and for these guys to love young Luke and not acknowledge the sequel trilogy. The sequel trilogy did not kill Star Wars, because the franchise has evolved so far beyond just being a handful of movies. Star Wars, like Star Trek before us, is now a collection of many stories, and it's up to each fan's unique tastes to choose which stories appeal the most to them. There are 9 versions of Spock, 40 versions of Sherlock Holmes, 31 versions of Superman, 40 versions of Batman, 19 versions of Catwoman, 2,428,475 versions of Spider-Man, 1 version of Tony Stark. And now there are 2 versions of Luke, Han, and Leia, and each of us gets to choose which version we prefer. Yes, we lost something very valuable when the sequel trilogy chose to destroy the characters and accomplishments of previous films. Yes, we have the right to be upset at what we lost. We will never get to see Luke's Jedi Academy, to see a new generation of young Jedi helping clean up the dregs of the Empire. Every time we see young Han and young Luke from now on, we'll have to mentally struggle not to remember the utter failures they turn out to be. But remember why you were here in the first place. Remember the moment you became a fan. That moment is never going to change. If the sequel trilogy depresses you,
it does not exist.
If the prequels upset you, then they do not exist. If you liked the Christmas Holiday Spectacular, then you do not exist. Now, I need to acknowledge that we have higher standards now than they had back in the 80s. If we look at some of the most influential artists of all time, Michelangelo lived over 500 years ago, Da Vinci lived 500 years ago, Rembrandt was 400 years ago, Van Gogh died in 1890. Artists like these were honing their craft for the past 1,000 years. By comparison, film is still growing as an art form. The first movie theater wasn't even built until 1905. The art of telling a story through a combined visual and audio medium is still in its infancy, but it has been evolving quickly. The bad films of today look like masterpieces compared to bad films made 70 years ago.
Bring back life. It's not natural. You with your weird idea. Haven't I stayed here and nursed dying dogs? Yeah. And even that miserable cat?
Thanks for bringing Opera to me. The Fire Nation is up to something. I have to go back now.
So comparing people disliking The Last Jedi to people disliking the holiday special is really difficult because there were 39 years of advancement in film, making The Last Jedi inherently a much better film. I also want to acknowledge that most of the bad quality films were made before the saga was truly past its initial growth spurts. Lucas was still trying to figure out what worked and what didn't, both as a filmmaker and as a leader of a booming franchise. In 2005, after completing 6 films and having thousands of additional hours of experience as a filmmaker, would he have tried to make a Star Wars holiday special at this point in his career? Probably not. So we do have to acknowledge the fact that fans in the past who were able to ignore really bad films knew the franchise was still in its growing pains, and that those terrible films were side stories not connected with the main saga. So yes, the sequel trilogy having bad films is entirely different, because they're main saga films and were made over 30 years after Lucas had already figured out roughly what worked for a Star Wars film and what didn't. Now, I've contradicted myself a fair bit in this video in an effort to fully cover all the counterarguments, but I believe my main point is still valid. The franchise will be fine. Fans who hated the prequels just ignored them and went right on being Star Wars fans. Fans who loved the prequels but hated Lord Jar Jar went right on loving the prequels and just ignored him. Fans who hate the idea of midichlorians just ignore them. And given a few years to let the disappointment die down, fans who hate the sequels will just ignore them as well. This is what fans have done through the entire history of all the biggest film and TV franchises. When he made the prequels, George Lucas didn't ruin your childhood. When they made the sequels, J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson didn't ruin your adulthood. When Ron added an angry fembot fighting for equal rights, that didn't ruin Leia or Padme or Mara Jade or any of the actual awesome women in Star Wars. Those older movies you fell in love with still exist, with all the glory and wonder and excitement you've always felt for them. If Galaxy's Edge fails to make money and gets shut down, it's okay. If a Boba Fett movie flops like Solo did, everything is still okay. If an Obi-Wan standalone film doesn't star Ewan McGregor, it's not the end of everything. The amazing hello there will always be in those 3 movies, shows, and comics where we first fell in love with the character. Our favorite characters were always going to be killed off eventually. And it is heartbreaking when they do, but amazing new characters will take their place. And even if the sequel trilogy is an utter failure, more movies, shows, and books are coming, and it is entirely possible the next Star Wars saga could be far, far better than even the originals. Star Wars isn't dead. Remember why you are here. Remember back to when you became a fan. Remember all the friendships you've gained. Remember all the amazing stories you've experienced along the way, and realize that nothing Disney ever does can take them away from you.
Oh, I'm a Jedi.
I am a Jedi.
I am a Jedi.
So hell yeah, I'm a Jedi, I think.
This is fucking awesome. Yeah!